In 64 CE, on the streets of Rome, a shocking spectacle unfolds. A naked woman, her body marred by wounds and waste, is dragged by chains toward the Colosseum. The crowd of thousands roars with what the script describes as bloodlust. This isn't just a brutal execution. It's a carefully orchestrated ritual of public shame. But what if this is just the beginning of a story that modern historians have deliberately buried for centuries? By the end of this video, you'll discover a brutal truth that will change how you see ancient Rome forever. I'm going to reveal 3 things that will haunt you. First, we'll expose how Rome turned public executions into a form of perverse entertainment. Second, we'll uncover the specific crimes that guarantee this horrifying fate. And third, you'll find out why emperors didn't just attend these events, they sometimes participated in them. If you're ready to face the darkest impulses of humanity, stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will make your blood run cold. We often picture ancient Rome through a lens of grandeur and civilization. We think of magnificent architecture, complex legal systems, and powerful empires. The popular image of Roman brutality is gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum. But that was often just the opening act for a much darker and more sinister spectacle. Rome had perfected something far more terrifying than simple execution. They had weaponized sexual humiliation as a form of state terror. For the Romans, death wasn't enough. The punishment had to be a public message. The empire needed to send a clear warning that would echo into every home and haunt anyone who dared to challenge their authority. Public executions weren't just about punishment. They were a form of theater. These meticulously choreographed spectacles were designed to break not just the body of the condemned, but their dignity and spirit as well. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated psychological campaign refined over centuries by emperors who understood that the threat of sexual humiliation could control an entire population. The most horrifying part of these rituals was their systematic nature. The public parade of a condemned woman was a warm-up act for what was to come in the arena. The air in the streets of Rome would be thick with the stench of fear and excitement as crowds gathered anticipating the spectacle. Guards would drag a naked woman through the city, her crime potentially anything from adultery to treason. The Roman poet Martial, in accounts that historians tried to bury, wrote about eyewitnesses who described the crowd throwing human waste, rotting vegetables, and sharp stones at these women. But this was far from a random walk. The guards would force the condemned to stop at specific, carefully chosen locations throughout the city. They would pause in front of temples she may have worshipped in, past the homes of her family members, and through markets where she once shopped. Why? Because the Romans understood that destroying a person's dignity was more powerful than simply ending their life. They were erasing her entire existence from the community. Martial even writes of one woman whose fingers were broken by guards when she tried to cover herself. Families were encouraged to attend these gruesome parades, with parents calling it an education for their children on the consequences of defying Roman law. Some relatives would even join the crowd, throwing stones at their own family members out of fear of suffering the same fate. The parade through the streets was only the beginning. What happened in the arena was even more horrifying. With 50,000 Romans packed into the stands, the atmosphere was more like a sporting event than an execution. But this spectacle was far from a simple fight between gladiators. It was a macabre, pornographic theatrical performance. Historians have tried to hide how women were forced to reenact mythological rape scenes before being killed. They would be dressed as mythological figures like Europa or Lear and Roman guards would bring in trained animals, not just for killing, but for sexual violence. The historian Cases Dio documented the trial of Empress Messalina, who was forced to endure every degradation Rome had perfected. She was stripped before senators and made to crawl through the arena on her hands and knees, while spectators threw objects at her. This wasn't just execution. It was called supplicium, the systematic destruction of a person's humanity. The crowd was never a passive observer. They were an active participant in the torture. The audience would vote on which torments to inflict next, and thumbs down for a quick death was rare. Roman mothers would point out specific torture techniques to their daughters, explaining how to avoid the same fate, while fathers would describe the women's screams as lessons in power and control for their sons. The emperor's box offered the best view for a reason. These events were a masterclass in imperial power, broadcast live to show what happened to anyone who challenged the system. In the most chilling detail of all, some women were still alive when the animals finished with them. The crowd would demand that they be kept conscious for the final act, slowly being dismembered while fully aware of their surroundings. This level of depravity was not an accident. It was a core part of the entertainment. There was one group of women whose punishment was designed to be even more terrifying. The Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were the most sacred women in all of Rome, tasked with maintaining the eternal flame that protected the empire. They were revered, untouchable, and more powerful than senators until they broke their vow of chastity. Rome couldn't simply kill a sacred priestess for fear of angering the gods, but letting her defiance go unpunished would undermine imperial authority. So they devised a punishment worse than public execution. Something so terrifying, it haunted Roman nightmares for generations. First, the accused Vestal Virgin was stripped naked in front of the entire Roman Senate. It was a slow ceremonial degradation that lasted for hours while senators debated her fate. But that was just the beginning. The historian Pliny the Younger documented how they would beat these women with rods until their skin split open, all while keeping them conscious. Then came the most horrifying part. They would be buried alive. She would be lowered into an underground chamber with just enough air to prolong her agony for days. A small lamp, some bread, and water were left with her. Not enough to live, but just enough to prolong her suffering. The chamber walls were lined with broken pottery to shred her fingers if she tried to claw her way out. Every detail was designed to maximize psychological torture. Romans would bring their families to listen to her screams from above ground for days, even weeks, calling it a religious ceremony. Plenty writes of one Vestal who survived for 18 days underground, slowly starving, in complete darkness. Here's the truth historians don't want you to know. Emperors didn't just watch these rituals. They designed them and participated in them. They turned sexual humiliation into their personal entertainment. Emperor Caligula didn't just attend executions. He choreographed them like theatrical productions. He would spend weeks planning every detail of a woman's degradation, consulting with architects, animal trainers, and torture specialists to create new forms of suffering. He would even invite foreign dignitaries to watch, turning it into diplomatic terrorism. Emperor Nero took this perversion even further. He would dress as a gladiator and personally participate in the sexual assault of condemned women. The crowd would cheer as their emperor committed these horrific acts, calling it divine justice. This wasn't just the madness of a few men. It was a systematic bureaucratic policy. This was not just about individual acts of sadism. Sexual humiliation became Rome's standard diplomatic tool and a core part of its government. When foreign queens defied Roman rule, they weren't just executed. Their degradation was broadcast across the empire as a warning to other rulers. The historical consequences were staggering. Entire cultures changed their laws about women's rights to avoid provoking Roman sexual torture. Treaties would even include specific clauses about the preservation of dignity in surrender terms. The Romans made sexual violence so systematic that they created government positions specifically for designing new torments. The magistrate of public degradation was a real job title with a salary and benefits. These horrific practices eventually ended, but not because of an imperial decree. It was because Christian influence began spreading through the empire, and Roman citizens slowly started questioning their entertainment. By the 4th century, the spectacles had largely ended. The Roman crowds simply lost their appetite for watching women be destroyed for entertainment. It took 3 centuries of Christian influence to stop practices that had become so normalized that families considered them educational entertainment. The psychological infrastructure of sexual humiliation was so deeply embedded in Roman culture that it outlasted almost every other form of arena entertainment. The final haunting detail died. When archaeologists excavated private Roman homes, they found domestic artwork depicting these execution scenes. The Romans had made this brutality so normal that it became home decor. What does this tell us about human nature? The legacy of institutionalized sexual violence reveals something terrifying. Any society can normalize the unthinkable if it serves those in power. What we've explored wasn't the product of individual madness. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and socially acceptable torture. And here's what should keep you up at night. Public shaming still functions in our society today. We just use different tools. Social media mobs, viral humiliation, and coordinated harassment campaigns. The technology changes, but the psychological impulse remains. The Romans convinced themselves they were civilized while cheering for sexual torture. What are we convincing ourselves of today? What entertainment are we consuming that future historians might judge as barbaric? What forms of public humiliation have we normalized without even realizing?